The Uyghur Genocide, a world that chose to look away. Why China must be held accountable now. Part I. There are moments in human history when silence becomes complicity, when neutrality becomes guilt, and when the refusal to speak transforms into the moral equivalent of pulling the trigger. Today, one such moment is unfolding before the eyes of a world that pretends to be blind. The genocide of the Uyghur people in China. Not possible genocide. Not alleged violations. Not troubling reports. A genocide, systematic, deliberate, state-engineered destruction of an entire ethnic, religious, and cultural group. For years, the Chinese government has waged a war of erasure against the Uyghurs of Xinjiang, a region they renamed the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, a title so dripping with irony that it becomes a dark joke. There is no autonomy in Xinjiang. There is no freedom in Xinjiang. There is only surveillance, fear, indoctrination, imprisonment, forced sterilization, and the crushing machinery of a state so paranoid and authoritarian that it considers the existence of a peaceful Muslim minority a threat to national security. The world knows. Every major intelligence agency knows. The United Nations knows. Amnesty International knows. Human Rights Watch knows. Western governments know. Muslim-majority countries know. Tech companies that quietly enable surveillance know. Fashion brands buying forced labor cotton know. Multinational corporations investing in China know. And yet the world does nothing. Why? Because China is too rich, too powerful, too economically essential for world leaders who worship profit above human life. Because governments that claim to stand for human rights fold like puppets when Beijing whispers trade agreement. Because corporations whose PR campaigns scream about ethical responsibility continue to gorge on forced labor to fatten their supply chains. Because the Muslim world, which has risen in fury over far lesser offenses, stays disturbingly, unforgivably silent when the persecutors are not Westerners, but the Chinese Communist Party. This article is not a diplomatic text. It is not written to comfort, to please, or to maintain polite distances. It is a blade sharp, necessary, and aimed directly at the hypocrisy of global powers that watched a genocide unfold and calculated that the financial cost of carrying was simply too high. The blueprint of a genocide. How China built a system of human destruction. Genocide does not begin with gas chambers. It begins with language. It begins with words like re-education, counter-extremism, social stability, integration. China mastered this vocabulary early, designing a framework for oppression that Western journalists, terrified of upsetting Beijing and losing access, took years to call by its true name. One, mass surveillance, turning a region into a digital prison. Xinjiang is the most intensely surveilled region on Earth, surpassing even North Korea. Cameras equipped with facial recognition sit on every street corner, at every shop, in every mosque, at every school. Artificial intelligence tracks movements, voices, biometrics, and social interactions. Phones are scanned. DNA is collected without consent. Apps monitor messages, photos, and private behavior. The technology that Silicon Valley created, China perfected, and the world ignored. The CCP built an algorithm called the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, IJOP, which categorizes Uyghurs into safe, suspicious, or dangerous, based on criteria so absurd and racist that they would be laughable if they were not being used to destroy real human lives. Dangerous activities include growing a beard, praying, frequently owning religious books, traveling abroad, using WhatsApp, having relatives overseas, speaking too passionately about Uyghur identity. The result? People disappear for nothing. Entire families vanish. Students return home to find their parents gone. Children are left orphaned by a regime that calls them state guardianship cases. 2. The concentration camps, the largest mass internment since the Holocaust. The world now knows, because satellite images, leaked CCP files, and survivor testimonies have made denial impossible, that China built a vast network of concentration camps. Not schools. Not vocational centers. Camps. Enormous, fortified, razor-wired prisons. More than 1 million Uyghurs have passed through these camps. Many will never come out. Inside, detainees are forced to renounce Islam, praise Xi Jinping, learn Mandarin, under threat of punishment, undergo political indoctrination, endure torture, sleep deprivation, and beatings, face solitary confinement for disobedience, witness women taken at night by guards, watch fellow prisoners collapse from hunger, illness, or despair. Survivors describe electric chairs, water torture, forced drug injections, sterilization procedures, and rape as a method of breaking resistance. These are not speculations. These are the testimonies of human beings whose only crime was being born Uyghur in a country whose government decided that their identity was incompatible with its vision of national unity. 3. Forced sterilization and population control, destroying the future of a people. The CCP understood something horrifyingly simple. A people cannot survive if it cannot reproduce. And so it turned its machinery not only against living Uyghurs, but against future generations. Reports confirmed by global experts document forced insertion of IUDs, mass sterilizations, forced abortions, removal of reproductive organ separation of men and women to reduce birth rate reduction of more than 60% in some Uyghur regions. This is not family planning. It is genocide in its purest legal definition, imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group. And the world continues to trade with the architects of this cruelty. 4. Forced labor. The 21st century slave economy. While Uyghurs are imprisoned, their labor becomes free profit for China, and for global brands happy to pretend they don't know the origins of the cotton, clothing, silicon, solar panels, and textile materials they buy. Up to 1 in 5 cotton garments worldwide is connected to forced labor in Xinjiang. The world is wearing genocide. The world is powering its electronics with genocide. The world is decorating its homes with genocide. And still, governments hesitate to confront China because supply chains, drenched in the suffering of a persecuted minority, must remain stable. 5. Cultural erasure. Killing a people without leaving corpses. Culture is not an accessory. It is the soul of a people. And China understood that destroying the Uyghurs required eliminating Uyghur language, Uyghur literature, Uyghur music, Uyghur religious life, Uyghur architecture, Uyghur cemeteries. Thousands of mosques have been demolished or desecrated. Cemeteries have been razed. Shrines destroyed. Children placed in state boarding schools where they are forbidden from learning Uyghur identity, history, or religion. It is the slow, deliberate murder of a civilization. 2. The audience of silence. How the world became complicit. Here is the harsh truth. China did not carry out this genocide in secret. It is not hidden. It is not ambiguous. The evidence is overwhelming. The agonizing testimonies are public. Satellite images are public. Leaked documents from Chinese officials themselves are public. The world is not silent because it doesn't know. The world is silent because it doesn't care enough to act. And the reasons behind this silence reveal the moral bankruptcy of the global order. 1. The United States. Condemnation without consequence. Washington criticizes China's treatment of Uyghurs, and then continues to maintain deep economic interdependence. The U.S. has sanctioned some Chinese officials, but not the politicians who truly engineered the genocide. Not Xi Jinping. Not the Politburo. Not the CCP's top brass. Why? Because American corporations depend on Chinese manufacturing. Because Wall Street depends on Chinese markets. Because Washington, for all its talk of human rights, will not risk an economic confrontation that could destabilize its currency, its supply chains, its investments. So America speaks loudly, and then does nothing meaningful. 2. The European Union. Morality for sale. Europe marched in the streets after the Holocaust, swearing never again. It built museums, memorials, educational programs, annual commemorations, and state policies to guarantee that genocide would never again be tolerated. Yet, here we are. Europe sees the camps. Europe sees the forced sterilizations. Europe sees the slave labor. And Europe continues to sign trade agreements with China. Never again, it appears, has an expiration date when money is involved. 3. The Muslim world. Silence that burns like betrayal. Perhaps the greatest moral failure comes from Muslim-majority nations that worship images of solidarity until the moment China is involved. Where is the outrage? Where are the protests? Where are the speeches? Where are the boycotts? The governments of Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, and others have gone so far as to publicly praise China's counter-extremism efforts. Some have even detained Uyghur refugees and deported them back to China, a guaranteed death sentence. When the persecutor is America or Israel, leaders shout. When the persecutor is China, they whisper. Or worse, they applaud. The Uyghurs have been abandoned by the very nations that claim to defend the global Muslim community. For the United Nations, paralysis by cowardice. The UN has issued reports full of vague, toothless language, but it has never declared genocide. Why? Because China sits on the UN Security Council. Because China has veto power. Because the institution that was created after World War II to prevent genocide is now held hostage by one of the world's most powerful authoritarian regimes. The Uyghurs were sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical diplomacy. 5 corporations. Profit above humanity. Apple, Nike, Zura, H&M, BMW, Volkswagen, Samsung, Panasonic. Every one of these companies has been linked to forced labor supply chains in Xinjiang. Each issued carefully worded PR statements. Each denies wrongdoing while continuing business. Not one has taken the full ethical stand of severing ties with Chinese supply chains altogether. Money wins again. 3. Accountability now, not in 20 years when it is safe to care. History will record this moment. And when it does, it will ask one devastating question. Where were you when the Uyghurs cried for help? Not 20 years later, when China's power declines and world leaders suddenly grow courage. Not 30 years later, when archives are opened and journalists finally write books about the horrors. Not when it becomes fashionable to condemn a genocide that has already succeeded. Where are you now? Because justice delayed is not justice denied. It is justice abandoned.